So my original research for almost 20 years really focused on environmental policy and environmental governance. So I was looking at how the pollution be controlled on the ground after environmental laws and policies were passed by government. So I was not looking at waste management until 2016 when I went to visit my PhD friends from Stanford both went to Stanford for PhD program, and that's when I discovered the very interesting things going on in Bangalore. So what happened is when they frustrated with the waste crisis in 2012, and they filed the public interest litigation laws with the state court and had a court order, which means they're going to mandate the entire city and focus on the residents' responsibility, which means they have to take charge of their waste by separating the waste at household level, and they also implement door-to-door collection to ensure the quality of separated waste is high. Then, because of the NGO citizen group involvement, they managed to get the court to pass an order mandate they call bulk generators. Basically, the residential area with 50 households or more to treat their food waste on site within the residential area. Right now, they have over 1,000 communities are doing the on-site composting of food waste. And the compost are able to sell to the farmers and use them for gardening. So one of the major findings I found this one-year project I set up later with a think tank in Bangalore, India, is the role of judiciary and court played in this legal process and implementation. So you really don't see traditionally the role of the government agency enforcing this law or court order is really by citizens, and NGOs are pushing the implementation and assisting the government enforcement. So we see this bottom-up approach really focus on decentralized management of the waste instead of like Europeans or US or Canada, where they mostly centralized approach of waste disposal, either by incineration and landfill or even compost is centralized mostly in those areas. But in Bangalore, you see, is a very small scale, intimate with humans. So you're talking about 50 kilograms per day of the food waste to several hundred kilograms a day. So it's small, but building the relationship with the community and the people. So I think the NGOs and courts in this process play a role we call bottom-up approach, as that I don't see that very often in China. So that's how I got interested in this project. So we started with the separation in 2000. So it's been almost 17 or 19 years now. But it's really from the top government and the order and wanted the people to follow that. And it never really happened. But in last 5 to 10 years, the environmental NGOs in China, which is a very small number of them, but they started pushing, trying out with individual community to see if we could actually get the citizens or residents to separate the waste at the household level. And there are very interesting NGOs came up, like in Shanghai called IFEN. So what they did is start 2012, they set up this company. It's more like a social enterprises. And it's more like an NGO, but it's registered as a company. So what they do is they work with the local, very bottom local level government and working with the residents and the residential committee, and to spend at least 3 to 6 months to get the people educated about the waste, how they separate waste, and how do they go process, and meanwhile how the waste being treated after separated. One thing I learned from them is building this coalition within a complex or residential area. Make sure people buy in this idea. So they have been trying this for almost 7-8 years. So that's something we see in last 5-10 years in China. A small number, but they had a successful experience. at the local level. And even though before 2018 they didn't go anywhere because it wasn't a big deal in China, people are mostly landfill the waste, and also incineration is coming up, but not so much focus on we call source separation of the food of the waste. So those NGOs in China, they started pushing and try to build up the successful experience. One thing I found is really interesting about them is they work with one and not other NGO communities and small and try to accumulate the experience. But the problem is once they had example, right? They had a successful experience is how to take it to the government. So you want the government to buy in this idea. So government would pass a law or policy to get it implemented. Until 2018, they didn't go anywhere. But again, this is the top approach, a top-down approach. So when the central government decide, like Xi Jinping came out to say something about we need to have waste separation. So Chinese called it is 垃圾分类是很重要的. So it's all about the separation. So, but at that point, it's the same as Bangalore. Government didn't know what to do. They only knew they wanted to achieve that, but they had no idea how to do it. So this point, those successful experience built by all those NGOs came to play. Shanghai is a perfect example. Like Shanghai this year, actually July 1st, they're going to have a citywide mandatory separation. And they have all those local volunteers going around to make sure people are separating their waste. And that model is built upon IFEN. So this local social enterprises I just mentioned, because they have over 300 residential communities that has some sort of source separation of the waste. And they helped build in the last 8 years. And so I think even though the situation is much different in India because we have much stronger government, but still there is room, like a very small room, but there's a room for NGO participation. And waste management happen to be not very sensitive issues. So there we say NGOs are playing a role as quite significantly. So that's the I hope for China, if we have anything for sustainable development, is this bottom-up approach that find their way into the government policy making when the opportunity arises. So in my view, that's why I support NGO. I sit on their board because I saw the potential. You're pushing until the opportunity arises and you're getting in there. So you do see that in China, not very often, but at least in waste management, we did see that. Okay, the ban on the waste import. I happened to be involved many years ago, probably 15 years ago, I can't quite remember. My friend used to be in charge of this at the Ministry of Environment Protection in China, and she basically sent me a bunch of papers, say, can you look at the problems? So there are bunch of the cart and imported from, I can't remember country, and stop at one of the port. And because what the problem is, it looks perfect fine from outside. It's a big cart, it's huge, like several tons per cart. But once they open that, the actual inside is all mix of the waste. It's claimed to be plastic or paper or cardboard, but when they open that big tank, and the inside is mixed very filthy waste. And they had no way to detect that before they import actually already crossed the border. Is already past examination because checking every card was impossible. So at that point, I remember I asked my friend because I never did any research on waste at that point. So I asked her, I said, why we imported those things? And she said, you know what, we short of the resources. And they separate really well from German, from other, and from Japan, and some actually from Southeast Asia. And they do really well because we don't separate our waste. And it's a mess. That's why we import from other countries. It has been going on for many years. Then at that point, I realized, we didn't do any separation. And so I think once China banned that, for domestically, in a way, particularly plastic, we don't have enough recyclable plastic for reuse. It's actually challenging. We need, I can't remember the exact number, but somewhere between 70 to 90% of this waste recyclable plastics to back to the industry, and we don't have the good quality of separated plastic. So when we banned the import, actually, for that particular sector, we more or less in trouble. So they are working really hard on this. That's why I think that's another reason probably they are really pushing for source separation. The question, the issue is once you promote separation at the household level, you not only increase the quantity of the waste like plastic, paper, and metal, then could be reused. You also improve the quality because none of the things are being contaminated by the wet waste or food waste or what we call organic waste. Then the quality and quantity both increased. So I would say this is something we really kind of sort of see happening in China because of the ban of the imported waste, pushing the government and also the local government to do more about the waste separation. But I heard, I didn't do any research on that, and this ban actually put a pretty hard time on some of the countries like Bangladesh. I heard they used to export a lot to China, all of a sudden stopped, and so they accumulated and have nowhere to sell, and so they had a hard time. So it's going to challenging for countries that used to sell to us, and also it's going to be challenging for Chinese also, because at this point it really needed to get hundreds of millions of Chinese to separate their waste, because we do need a separated high quality of those waste actually for reuse. Like Japan, I remember I talked to one of the Japanese scholar who actually was not so concerned about the ban on the waste export from Japan because they have such high quality of the separated waste like plastic and metal and cardboard. Those are really good quality because Japan uses good materials to produce those products. And once those are used, because of good materials and the waste become good quality, right? So they are not so concerned about exporting those things to other countries because there are demand for those. If you separate it and good quality, and the country would want that because reuse actually costs less resources, right? You're protecting your environment. So I would say this is challenging for everybody because China is such a huge import of the waste, but it's in the good. Particularly, I'm talking about decentralized waste management. You shouldn't send your waste to other countries anyway. It's time to push those developed countries to rethink about the approach. They have been using mostly focus on centralized approach. Now you got to do something locally, reduce the transportation. That would bring the secondary pollution, and you also bring the cost more energy, and also you reduce the air and water pollution, and you increase the ratio of the waste being used locally. So it's economically environmental sound approach for any country anyway. Also, if you focus on the community level, you really building the people's relationship as the society become increasingly individualized, and the society in a way is so segmented. Now you actually bring them together through this decentralized approach. So I see that as a good thing actually in many ways. And everybody has to change. All the countries have to adopt this different policy and approach to deal with that. In the end, I think it will be good for humans and or for the environment. Thank you.